In the autumn of 1929, a British naval survey vessel called HMS Meridian departed Cape Town bound for the eastern Weddell Sea with orders to investigate a thermal anomaly that a Royal Navy surveyor had noted and filed without follow-up 8 years earlier. The expedition was funded jointly by the British Admiralty and the Royal Geographical Society. It carried 23 men, 11 officers, a full crew, a geologist, a meteorologist, a photographer, and a civilian scientist named Dr. Arthur Pemberton from the University of Edinburgh, who had spent 20 years studying subglacial geology and had specifically requested to be included when he obtained access to the original 1921 anomaly report. The expedition was authorized for 90 days. It lasted 140. When HMS Meridian returned to Cape Town in early April of 1930, 4 members of the crew were missing and were never formally accounted for. Dr. Pemberton was removed from the ship before it docked, transferred without his personal papers to a private medical facility in Sussex, and held there for 3 years. Commander Edward Holt, the expedition's leader, submitted his full log to the Admiralty on arrival and never spoke publicly about the voyage again. In 1931, the British Admiralty issued a classification order on all records associated with the HMS Meridian's 1929 expedition under the Official Secrets Act. The stated reason was that the expedition had passed through waters relevant to ongoing British sovereign territorial claims in Antarctica. That classification has been renewed every decade since. The full logs have never been released. They have never been reviewed by a civilian court. No surviving crew member ever gave a formal account on record. What we know about what HMS Meridian found in 1929 comes from 3 private sources: a retired Admiralty clerk, a recovered personal letter, and handwritten annotations found in a second-hand book in Edinburgh in 1994, and from a single fragment of Holt's log that one of those sources managed to read before the documents were removed from public reach. What those sources describe should not exist. And the fact that the British government has spent 95 years ensuring it stays classified suggests that somewhere in a filing room nobody will name, they already know that. Before we go further, if you find yourself in the middle of one of these investigations and you want more, hit subscribe and turn on the bell. We post deep dives into suppressed history, Tartarian research, and the civilizations the official record has tried to erase every single week. Now, let's go back to 1929. To understand why HMS Meridian was sent where it was sent, you have to understand what Antarctica was supposed to be in 1929. And what certain expeditions kept quietly noting that it was not. By the late 1920s, the continent had been mapped in rough outline for about a century. The dominant scientific assumption, the one still maintained in mainstream geology today, was that Antarctica had been sealed beneath its ice sheet for somewhere between 15 and 34 million years. The ice was ancient. The land beneath it was geologically inert. Nothing lived there. Nothing had lived there in any period relevant to human history. Antarctica was the world's oldest and most complete deep freeze. Any report that did not match that description was a data anomaly to be explained away, not followed up on. The problem was that certain data anomalies kept appearing. Thermal readings taken during the Scott expedition in 1912 showed water temperatures inside specific coastal inlets that were inconsistent with the surrounding ocean by a margin that localized volcanic activity could not cleanly explain. The Shackleton expedition noted similar readings in 1914 along the Weddell Sea approach. Both sets of data were logged. Both were formally attributed to subglacial volcanic influence and filed without further action. The anomalies were small enough to fit inside an acceptable explanation. They were not small enough to forget. In 1921, a Royal Navy survey vessel mapping the outer edge of the Weddell Sea ice shelf recorded something that the volcanic explanation could not reach. Inside a specific coastal inlet, the water temperature was running 11 degrees Celsius warmer than the surrounding ocean in winter, under conditions where that water should have been frozen completely solid for months. The surveyor on duty filed the reading with a formal recommendation for follow-up and submitted it to the Admiralty. The Admiralty sat on the recommendation for 8 years. When Dr. Pemberton, who had obtained access to archived thermal records as part of his subglacial research program, identified the 1921 reading and formally applied to lead an investigation, the Admiralty approved the request. HMS Meridian's 1929 voyage was the result. Pemberton's specific mandate was to take atmospheric and water samples inside the inlet, map the thermal gradient at multiple depths, and if the passage proved navigable, to follow it as far inland as the vessel could safely go. They arrived at the inlet in late October of 1929. The meteorologist on board, a man named James Culver, wrote in a private letter to his brother, recovered in 2003 as part of a family archive donation to a maritime library in Aberdeen, that the first thing he noticed on approach was the smell. His word was green. He said the air smelled green, like fresh rain on living soil, like vegetation after a storm. He was in Antarctica in late October, at the edge of the Weddell Sea, where no vegetation and no soil and no rain-softened earth should be accessible to any instrument or any nose. Thomas Avery, the photographer attached to the expedition, took 14 photographic plates of the inlet on the day of first approach. All 14 were surrendered to an Admiralty officer on the dock at Cape Town on their return. What those plates showed, Avery described only once in a letter to his wife, recovered alongside Culver's letter in the 2003 archive donation. He wrote that the photographs showed open water extending inland from the coast, not a coastal lead, not a shore polynya that opens seasonally along the ice shelf edge. A liquid water channel cutting directly into the continent, flanked on both sides by glacial ice that should have sealed it completely and somehow had not. They followed it. The passage, according to the log fragment quoted by retired Admiralty clerk George Hadfield in a 1978 interview published in a small maritime history journal, extended inland for approximately 40 miles before the overhead ice formed a continuous ceiling above the water, enclosing the channel in a tunnel of glacial ice with navigable open water running beneath it. The air temperature inside the tunnel held steady at approximately 4 degrees Celsius. Cold, but liquid. The walls were ice. The ceiling was ice. The water beneath the keel of HMS Meridian was open, unfrozen, and holding at 9 degrees Celsius, above what any documented process in that region could produce. Culver's atmospheric samples taken inside the tunnel were detecting organic particulate matter suspended in the air. His entry for that measurement does not speculate on what kind. It does not propose a source. It records the reading and notes that Pemberton had reviewed it and requested that course be maintained. Organic particulate, suspended biological matter in the air of the interior of the Antarctic ice sheet. Something alive was producing it, in a place where nothing was supposed to be alive. They kept going. What the expedition found at the end of the passage has come to us from 3 independent sources. From Hadfield, who read the full log before the classification order removed it from access. From Avery's letter to his wife. And from a series of handwritten annotations found in 1994 in a personal copy of a Royal Geographical Society survey report purchased from a second-hand bookshop in Edinburgh, with handwriting that a graphologist subsequently assessed as consistent with Arthur Pemberton's documented hand from the period. All 3 agree on the structure of what they encountered. The tunnel opened, The ice ceiling rose and widened and eventually disappeared overhead, replaced by a vault of translucent glacial material through which diffuse light came without a visible source, a cavity. An open interior space beneath the ice sheet large enough that Hadfield, drawing on the log, described it as the size of an English county. The air temperature inside the cavity was warmer than the tunnel. Culver put it at approximately 9 degrees Celsius. The humidity was high, consistent with active evaporation from a large body of water. There was a body of water, an interior lake, partially frozen at its far edges, liquid at its center and along the stone shoreline that ran along the near side. And along that stone shoreline, structures. Hadfield calls them buildings. Avery calls them stone towers. He adds a phrase that is difficult to interpret until you read the other accounts alongside it. He writes that they looked old in a way that was different from the way ruins look old. He does not elaborate. He moves on in the letter. But the distinction he is reaching for becomes legible when you read Pemberton's annotations. Pemberton writes of regular vertical elevations of worked stone, partially submerged along the waterline, partially intact above it, arranged in a spatial relationship to one another, consistent with deliberate planning at urban scale. He uses the word urban. He uses the word deliberate. He estimates the height of the intact structures at between 40 and 60 feet. He notes that the stonework belongs to no architectural tradition he has studied. He notes the absence of tool marks consistent with any cutting or dressing technique he can identify. He notes the proportional relationship between the structures and their spacing, which he describes as conforming to a geometric regularity that suggests a planning discipline he cannot name. And then he notes the detail that stands out from every other observation in the annotations. The surface of the stone resists ice adhesion. Every other exposed surface within the cavity, the rocky shoreline, the base of the ice walls, the upper faces of submerged stone, is coated in accumulated frost. The structures are not. Whatever they are made of, ice will not bond to it. They have been inside this cavity, surrounded by ice, for a period of time that Pemberton does not attempt to estimate, and they are clean. This is where the Tartarian framework enters the account, and once it enters, it does not leave. For the past 2 decades, independent researchers working without institutional funding or academic protection have been assembling a body of evidence for a civilization that predates the historical record we have been given. The working name, drawn from the cartographic tradition of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, is Tartaria. The first edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published in 1771, describes Great Tartary as the largest empire in the world by land area. The entry is shorter in the second edition. It is absent in the third. By the fourth edition, it has been removed completely, not revised, not relocated, not reorganized under a different heading. Gone. The cartographic tradition that placed Great Tartary on dozens of European maps from multiple independent traditions across 3 centuries simply stopped, without a conquest, without a partition, without a succession treaty, without the kind of documentary residue that the disappearance of any empire of that scale would normally produce. What the Tartarian research community has documented in the decades since is a specific architectural fingerprint appearing across the territory that those maps once covered and well beyond it. Structures built at a scale and with a precision that does not correspond to the tools or the organizational capacity of the populations officially credited with constructing them. Foundation materials with properties that current materials, science cannot replicate. Heating and ventilation systems embedded in buildings attributed to civilizations that are not supposed to have possessed that knowledge. And stone. A specific category of worked stone, appearing across multiple continents, in structures attributed to multiple separate cultures, with a surface treatment that resists weathering, resists biological growth, and according to the independent analysis of several researchers working on the construction anomalies of Central Asian buildings that predate the civilizations officially assigned to them, resists molecular bonding under conditions of sustained cold and moisture. Ice adhesion is a form of molecular bonding, a stone to which ice will not adhere in sub-zero conditions over an extended period has been treated with a surface chemistry sophisticated enough to prevent that bonding at the molecular level. That is not primitive construction. That is not any construction in the current official record. It is something else, and Pemberton described exactly that stone in exactly those conditions, inside a cavity, under the Antarctic ice sheet, in structures he could not assign to any known architectural tradition, arranged in a pattern he described as deliberately urban. The implication, if you follow the Tartarian framework, is not complicated. It is simply very large. The civilization, whose traces appear in the suppressed surveys, the pulled encyclopedias, the misattributed architecture from Central Asia to the American Midwest to the Saharan edge, that civilization reached Antarctica. It built there. Whatever event removed Tartaria from the maps and the institutional memory of the 19th century did not remove what was built under the ice, because the ice sealed it, preserved it at 9 degrees Celsius in a cavity lit by refracted glacial light for a duration nobody currently has the evidence to calculate. Holt's expedition remained inside the cavity for 4 days. On the second day, 4 crew members went ashore onto the stone quay. They were not sent, they went. Holt's log records them going ashore and does not record Holt ordering it. It records that they did not return. He waited 18 hours before giving the order to withdraw. His notation for that decision contains no explanation. At the bottom of the page, added in what Hadfield described as a different weight of pencil, written at a different time from the main entry, is a single line. It reads, "We were not the first to come here. I do not believe we were meant to leave. They left." Holt, Culver, Avery, Pemberton, and the remaining 19 crew members navigated back through the tunnel, back into the Weddell Sea, and back north to Cape Town. On the dock, before the ship was cleared for disembarkation, an Admiralty officer came aboard. Pemberton was removed first, without his papers, and driven away in a car that was waiting on the quay. Avery surrendered his 14 plates to the officer without being asked twice. The officer did not inquire about the camera. He did not ask whether there was additional unexposed film. The letter to his wife, written from Cape Town the morning after docking, mentions that Avery had kept a second roll separate and had taken 2 additional plates on the morning of departure from the cavity. He intended to have them developed in London. He believed they were important. Avery died in 1962. His estate was sold by auction. A researcher who spent 6 months tracing every item from that auction found no photographic material of any kind among Avery's recovered possessions. Culver gave one public interview in his life, in 1955, to a journal focused on polar meteorology. He was asked, in a question that appeared routine in context, whether he had encountered atmospheric readings during his career that he had found genuinely inexplicable. He answered that he had encountered one such reading and that the explanation, if it existed, was above his clearance level. The interviewer moved on. The journal did not follow up. That single sentence is the only public statement any surviving member of the HMS Meridian expedition ever made about what the voyage found. The 4 men who did not return were listed in Royal Navy records as lost at sea during a navigational incident. Their families were informed that the specific circumstances of the incident could not be disclosed under the Official Secrets Act. They had no avenue of appeal. That was the final communication any of those families ever received about what happened to their men. Pemberton was released from the Sussex facility in 1933. He returned to Edinburgh without his papers and without a university position. He published nothing. A colleague who visited him in 1946 wrote that he found Pemberton mentally intact and entirely unwilling to engage with any subject related to anything that had occurred after 1928. He died in 1961. His estate was handled by a solicitor who had been retained on a standing arrangement by a firm Pemberton's family could not identify. In 2019, a Freedom of Information request filed by a researcher at the Scott Polar Research Institute seeking declassification of the HMS Meridian records was returned with a standard refusal. The grounds cited were ongoing national security relevance, a 1929 Antarctic naval survey, national security relevance, in 2019. That phrase either means a classification was maintained through bureaucratic inertia without active review, which is entirely possible and happens constantly in government archives, or it means that someone with access to those files reviewed them within a recent enough period to make an active determination. There is no third interpretation. What is in that cavity is still there. The stone that ice cannot touch does not stop resisting the ice because a classification order was issued. The water in that passage does not stop being warm because the report about its temperature was removed from circulation. Whatever is generating the thermal signature that a Royal Navy surveyor noticed in 1921 and that HMS Meridian followed to its source in 1929 has been generating it continuously since before either of those men was born. Holt wrote that they were not the first to come there, which means someone else came before 1929 and left evidence of their presence. Someone built the structures on that stone quay. Someone dressed that stone with a surface treatment that ice will not bond to across any duration of cold. Someone planned and organized and built at urban scale in a cavity under the Antarctic ice in a period that no current timeline of human civilization can account for. We were not the first. Holt's own words. Written in a log that has been kept from every civilian researcher who has ever requested it. Filed in a room that the British government has renewed its reasons to lock every decade for 95 years. Behind a sealed door that the Official Secrets Act keeps closed not because of territorial claims, not because of navigational sensitivity, but because of what is on the other side of it. The cavity is still there. The structures are still standing. The ice still will not touch them. The question is not whether someone built them. They were built. The question is whether we will ever be given permission to know who, and if we are not, whether the ground will eventually answer that question for us without asking permission at all. If you want to go further into what polar exploration has found and suppressed, we have a full playlist of investigations into Tartarian construction, forbidden archaeology, and the expeditions that came back with answers nobody was allowed to hear. Watch the next one now. The answer is already in the next frame.